Kyle Dacuyan is a poet, performer, and translator. His poems appear in Diagram, Lambda Literary, Foundry, and Best New Poets, among other places. And he is the recipient of scholarships from Poets House, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Academy of American Poets. Prior to joining the Poetry Project, he served as co-director of National Outreach and Membership at PEN America, where he led the launch of a nationwide community engagement fund for writers. Before that, he served as associate director at the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kyle.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you to everyone at Village Preservation. Thanks to everyone who's tuning in. I feel you and perceive your presence. I'm really happy and excited to be giving this talk, to have an opportunity to share a little bit about a place that's really beloved to me, the Poetry Project, where I have been the executive director for just over 2 years now, almost 3 years. The Poetry Project, if you aren't familiar with what we do, I'll give you the brief picture. We experiment and model what can happen when a community organizes radically around poetry. And we do that through a combination of presenting live events, readings, performances, lectures, conversations, as well as through a learning program of workshops and master classes and fellowship programs. And we have a number of publications as well, a quarterly kind of critical review, a literary magazine, and more recently, a media publication as well. And we've been based out of St. Mark's Church in the Bowery at 10th Street and 2nd Avenue since 1966. I'm going to be talking tonight about a little bit about the history of the Poetry Project. And I'm drawing from 2 documents in particular. One is a collectively authored oral history of the Poetry Project. You're looking right now at the outside of the very elaborate manila folder, which holds this sheaf of papers. It's a typewritten document from 1978, put together by the poet Bob Holman, transcribed from dozens of late night interviews and conversations with poets who were foundational to the Poetry Project. And it's not even staple bound. It's extensively annotated with different colored ink and corrections and comments. It's a very it's a extremely choral and extremely quarrelsome document of our history. The other document that I'm drawing from is Miles Champion's excellent piece, Insane Podium, A Short History of the Poetry Project, 1966 to 2012. These are really the two documents that tell as deeply as we have available the story of the Poetry Project over its 55-year history. I'm adding into my talk a little bit of what I know from what I've heard from different members of our community, which is by no means it's not a thoroughly archival picture. It's a very community-driven picture, and one which I'm sure folks might offer some kind of intervening perspective into. And so I hope if that might come forward in our Q&A or conversation towards the end of this talk. My hope is also to speak more to the spirit of the work that we do and the people who have shaped the Poetry Project, and what I see as a particular connection to the character of the neighborhood where we are situated, which I think includes a magnetism to the avant-garde and the experimental, to pleasure, and also to expansive, deeply mutual, and often shifting visions of utopia. Um, so before, I'm going to switch to another image now. Before there was a poetry project at St. Mark's Church-in-the-Bowery, there were a number of reading series organized in coffee houses on the Lower East Side, starting from readings at the McDougal Street Bar in the 1950s, which later became the Gaslight Poetry Cafe. You see that image on the left, as well as 10th Street Coffee House between 3rd and 4th Avenue, which later became Les Deux Mégots on East 7th Street. And also Café La Metro. You see an image from a flyer of Café La Metro on the right. That was just down the street from the church on 2nd Avenue. Among the poets who were organizing these readings were Paul Blackburn, Carol Berger, Jerome Rothenberg, Diane Wachowski, Joel Oppenheimer, and Anne Waldman, who later became all deeply involved in the work of the project. Meanwhile, St. Mark's Church-in-the-Bowery had for many decades been welcoming and supportive to a number of experimental poets and artists. W.H. Auden, who you see on the left, that's a photo from Richard Avedon on St. Mark's Place. W.H. Auden had been a parishioner at the church, and along with Khalil Gibran, Vachel Lindsay, and Edna St. Vincent Millay, he'd been a member of the St. Mark's Arts Committee. William Carlos Williams, John Ashbery, Jackson McLough, Reed Dragonette, Anselm Hollow, all of these folks had given talks and readings at the church in the years preceding our formal presence as a poetry project. And the poet Archie Shepp had been hosting free jazz concerts in the west yard of the church for a number of years. So there was this thriving artistic energy in the neighborhood and specifically at the church. And that's traceable to what Champion calls the, quote, unorthodox rectorship of the decidedly modernist Dr. William Norman Guthrie, whose practice and study of theology encompassed artistic expression as an important language of worship and religion. And that artistic identity surrounding the church continued under the Reverend Richard McEvoy, who introduced the visual arts program, and under Reverend Michael Allen, who was ultimately the person who welcomed the poets to St. Mark's. How did this relationship between the poets and St. Mark's become formalized in place? Well, in April 1966, the poet John Ashbery had been invited to give a reading at St. Mark's after a decade in Paris. He was introduced by the poet Ted Berrigan. About a month after this reading, Harry Silverstein, from a professor of sociology at the New School, called Reverend Allen and asked if he thought St. Mark's could use $90,000. Silverstein and the New School had come to receive a 2-year grant recently from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And these funds were earmarked for the socialization of juvenile delinquents. And they needed to allocate these funds or risk losing them. So they approached Reverend Allen and asked if he had any sort of idea for a way that these funds might be applied using some kind of programming already present at the church. So several arts projects already had a sort of nascent, unformalized presence in the church around this time. In addition to the poetry project, there was Theater Genesis, as well as a film project. And all of these ended up coming together under a grant proposal that Silverstein and Allen entitled Creative Arts for Alienated Youth. So the original funding, which instantiated the poet's presence at St. Mark's, was really under the auspices of youth programming. And you see in this image on the right a number of the participants in that youth programming. And in particular, I want to point out that the person on the left of the statue of Stuyvesant is Louis Fregosa, who is a relation of Jimmy Fregosa, the longtime sexton at St. Mark's for decades, probably the longest tenured presence in the church. So a number of specific folks in the church's history were really influential and essential to bringing the poets in. I want to specifically point out Stephen Facey, who you see in the image on the left. Stephen was also involved in the structure of the church, but specifically in building a kind of administrative structure for the arts projects working together in the early years of the Poetry Project's presence there. Stephen has also really been a key keeper of the archive. So I think this image that you see on the left is the Bishop of New York, the Right Reverend Paul Moore, and then the woman to his right is the poet Anne Waldman, and then David Garcia, and then Stephen Facey. I want to emphasize that the generosity of the church in welcoming the poets and the example of the church, I think, has been really has just really imbued the spirit of the work that we do. In addition to giving us a formal space for presenting readings and workshops, being situated in a church has sort of connected the poets of the Poetry Project with a particular justice commitment, and especially in creating a place that was really a community. And all of that had a radial effect on what we've come to recognize and characterize as downtown art and culture. So the poets in the early years of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's were giving readings. They were also offering free writing workshops. And I can't emphasize enough how original and transgressive and novel these free writing workshops were at a time when the ladder of American literature was really tied pretty rigidly to university campuses. But the poets were also sustaining one another in different ways too. On the right is a photo of a number of the poets who were deeply involved in the Poetry Project's early years, along with their families. So there's Alice Notley, Ted Berrigan, Anne Waldman, Lewis Warsh, all of these poets who were kind of working together to shape and build this wildly experimental poetry community. While they were giving readings and teaching, they were also, sharing childcare and meals and encountering and organizing with different activist organizations. If I take a look at the list of readings that were part of the Poetry Project's early programming, I find benefit events for the Berkeley Defense Fund. I find benefit events for drug bust release and bail, a benefit for the Catonsville Nine. Those were a number of Catholic activists who had burned draft files in protest against the Vietnam War. So there was this really kind of radical spirit that surrounded the community that built the early years of the Poetry Project. And I think that we see that even in the foundational document of our history, this oral history. It was all about confluence, contact, encounter, surprise, mutuality, in that way that I think Jane Jacobs sense of what distinguishes a city socially. the community of for the community of poets who were surrounding the poetry project, culture wasn't just this discrete audience going activity. Writing, giving readings, teaching, all of this was woven into the fabric of community life. And I think that's really something, again, which developed out of the generosity and example of the church. Um, it also, I think that kind of swirling social energy was what put the poets in contact with the painters. A number of painters uh, had close friendships with the poets of the Poetry Project. Philip Guston, Joe Brainerd, Keith Haring, Gordon Matta Clark. All of them were deeply involved in uh, friendships with poets, making flyers for poetry readings, even sharing work at the project. There were friendships with music makers, John Cage, Philip Glass, Yoko Ono, Laurie Anderson, Laurie Spiegel, Joan LaBarbera. All of these were people who shared work at the Poetry Project earlier in their careers and over time. And of course, there were our enduring friendships with the dancers. Dance Space was originally founded by poet friends who wanted a place to support the dancers, and a similar affinity had been nurtured at Judson with the Poets Theater and Judson Dance Theater. I think at least some of the basis for these cross-genre affinities was a mutual recognition of this endeavor to think, see, and listen in a manner outside of convention. The dancers and artists and composers all recognized in poetry this work of disambiguating language from convention and meaning to reach toward another level or mode of feeling. When we feel moved inexplicably or wordlessly by a symphony or a dance performance or an abstract artistic work, I think that's not so different from the experience of poetry. It's just that poetry happens in language, and we spend so much of our time in work and in social life clinging to this expectation that language be functional or be straightforwardly communicative or legible. And the poets propose, what if we abandon that grip of obligation on our words and let something wilder and more intuitively and pleasurably guided manage the ways we're moving through language? I talked a little bit about kind of mutuality and the spirit of mutuality that I think is kind of descended from the space of the church. And I want to also add that I think pleasure has really been a central force in the utopian spirit of the Poetry Project. And you see that in examples like the marathon, the New Year's Day Marathon, which is our largest fundraiser. It's a program we've been running for 47 years. Every January 1st, 150 to 200 poets, dancers, musicians, interdisciplinary artists share work over the period of a day. And it's a raucous, unwieldy, unpredictable, real touchstone annual gathering of the entire downtown artistic community. I think that's a real manifestation of the kind of pleasure force at the Poetry Project. And then there are also these kinds of folkloric stories of early events. I think of, there's a fabled event, I think in April 1968, the poet John Giorno spiked a punch bowl with LSD, served it to a number of listeners at the church, and then delivered a kind of poetry sermon from the bell tower. But there were also, I think, more substantive, pleasure-driven programs that were presented at the project as well. Amiri Baraka organized a number of symposia in the early years with revolutionary choirs. And this rowdy spirit is something we've held on to, but the project has also, I think, stepped seriously into being a center for thought. The Poetry Project newsletter was established in 1972, and that was originally meant as a kind of just a monthly circulating community newsletter talking about births and deaths and marriages and apartment hunts and job searches for poets. But it was also a place where poets listed and wrote about one another's work. And over time, that's become really, the Poetry Project newsletter has become this central document of the poetic and broader literary and artistic avant-gardes. There's also the experimental learning program that's been shaped and brought into place at the Poetry Project. That was originally established under the director Bernadette Mayer. And it has continued as a kind of open access school. Poets like Eileen Miles, who also later became the director, have said that their dedicated study and tutelage in poetry happened at the project through the free workshops and learning programs that we offered. A lecture program also started by Mayer and stewarded by the poet Charles Bernstein, eventually expanded into a symposium by the director Ed Freeman. And these lectures and symposia have yielded a tremendous body of scholarship. Some of the speakers have included Agnes Martin, Judy Grahn. More recently, Frank Wilderson gave a talk on Afro-pessimism. We had a talk from the quantum physicist Karen Barad. There's always been this kind of, I think the learning program at the project has been shaped by this idea that everyone deserves access to radical, experimental, non-hierarchical ideas and models of knowledge and poetics. More recently, Anselm Berrigan led the placement of our archive at the Library of Congress, and Stacy Samazik, both of these were the two directors preceding me, initiated our fellowship program. The presence of the archive at the Library of Congress, the development of this fellowship program, again, I think these contribute to the seriousness of the project as a center for learning and poetic experimentation. I've talked a little bit about several of the directors, but beyond this, there are also the many curators and editors who've been foundational to the Poetry Project, Chris Kraus and Maggie Nelson. The project has been home for all kinds of radical traditions of the last half century: the Beats, the New York School poets, the language poets, the Black Mountain poets. And the Poetry Project has always maintained esteem and friendship with a number of global counterparts. This counter-hierarchical, local, community-based spirit is a part of our experimentation today. We've recently put together a series of community dialogue programs, discourses, which are group facilitated dialogue and exercise based writing and discussion programs. We've also ventured, as everyone else has, into presenting online programming. I think, what we do has always been precarious and improbable, but our work endures because there continue to be friends and listeners who recognize that poetry is essential to community, that poetry changes the ways we listen to and work with and recognize one another and ourselves, ourselves in relation to one another. And because we find in poetry other possibilities for speaking and being together. So I wanted to just, I hope that in talking a little bit about our history, I've leaned more into the spirit of what we do. And again, I want to say that um, the welcome of the church to the poetry project, I think, has just been so critical to establishing a real spirit and focus on community. That's I'm going to kind of wrap up my formal remarks there, and maybe switch to Q&A or to conversation with Lena, and to questions that you all might have submitted.
Thank you, Kyle. That was wonderful. Thanks for sharing all of that. So I'd love for folks to post in the Q&A. I can definitely think of some questions myself, though. I was wondering, Kyle, you talked about the importance of the newsletter and how that kind of changed form over time, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about The World, which was the magazine, I think started by Anne Waldman, I'm not sure. I know it came up a lot in Miles's history, so I was wondering if you had anything about that or about other kind of like offshoot publications or things like that.
Yeah, there were a whole bunch of publications that came out of the project. And it really kind of stems from a specific machine that we had. We had this mimeograph machine, which was like a hand cranked early copier, basically. And it allowed you to really quickly mass produce flyers and publications and magazines. So the early editions of The World, which were, I think we put out like 6 editions of The World a year in the early years. It was edited by the poet Anne Waldman. They were on like legal size paper, staple bound, and they were literary journals that were put together in a period of weeks. And the simplicity of the machine, the kind of this radical feat of fast mass-produced printing made it possible for a community of poet friends to put out their work quickly and on a scale that hadn't been possible before. And so the World really became this important, it became like an important arm of work that was happening really locally around the project. It made it possible for people who were not geographically situated in New York City to connect with this really vibrant work that was happening here. And there were a number of other mimeographed publications that were that came out of the project in addition to The World. Adventures in Poetry, Maureen Owen's amazing literary journal Telephone, just a bunch of radical and important small press publications. I think I saw in the chat Marcella Durand mentioned Caveman. I'm not familiar with Caveman, I have to say, but I'm guessing that it's in the lineage of these amazing small press publications. Even beyond the mimeographed work, you have these 2nd and 3rd generation publications like Aufgabe that were just all kinds of of little presses and little magazines that spun out of these friendships and gatherings.
Marcelo is saying that Caveman was the way underground Mimeo publication at the project. And sometimes I wish that we were in a meeting so that Marcelo would be able to chime in, but thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. And I hadn't heard of that either, but I'm thinking of like the floating bear as well.
Yes.
Put together. I'm sure we've got a lot on our staff blog as well.
Yes, Alice, Marcella says Alice Motley would know more. Alice would definitely know more. Alice is also an amazing visual artist. And I think Alice had run a kind of analogous publication. I think it was just called Chicago. Originally, Alice and Ted had been in Chicago at some time, but a bunch of these publications, in addition to being Mimeo produced, produced among kind of friends and collaborators and peers and co-conspirators, a lot of the visual art was produced by poets or friends of poets. So Joe Brainard, George Schneemann, Mimi Gross. You had this really exciting, rich visual art that was happening in the publications as well.
Great. Another sort of question or thing that I was interested in is when you were talking about the origins of the newsletter, and it seems like it had functioned as more of a newspaper, like a more sort of like a community newspaper with like things that were very specific to the people and their families and things like that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I didn't realize it because at the moment it's more of like a collection of literature and art, and I'm sort of wondering how it made that transition.
It's just evolved in all kinds of backwards and forwards ways under different editorships, and amazing poets have been editors of the newsletter. But originally, when it was founded in, I think it was 1972, under Ron Padgett's directorship, it was meant to be like a kind of get out the word publication. Here are the events that are happening at the Poetry Project. These are the workshops we're offering this month. These are the readings. This poet is moving to New York from the Bay Area, and he's looking for a place to live. It was functional. It was to help poets share news and needs with one another. And it was also, it was sort of, it maintained the playful, cheeky tone that I think characterizes the project too. So you see a lot of like gentle and sometimes not so gentle ribbing and sparring between poets across issues of the newsletter. Poets who are objecting to one another in letters to the editor, or poets who feel a particular way about a new format for the newsletter. Really, what I see as a through line that's evolved over time has been, the newsletter's also always been a space where poets are reviewing and writing about and thinking about one another's work. And so I think because that was adjacent in these early years to this more kind of social function, you see that manifest in the scholarship. So there's like a particular mode of scholarship that emerges out of the Poetry Project that kind of dignifies and recognizes that our reading of poetry is also inflected with all kinds of social relation. And I think that's, that matters, that has import, and that's kind of guided over decades now, just a very particular kind of critical analysis that you don't find elsewhere. That continuity between the ways poets live and the ways poets write and the ways poets are thinking about one another's work, that emerges in a really specific way from the space of the newsletter.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. uh, Niles has a question. Well, I guess first I'll share. Niles wanted to share, who, just for context, is a family friend of mine who grew up right around the church, and he says that Michael Allen allowed the Black Panthers to have a breakfast program at the church in the
Yes.
60s.
Yeah, I mean the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, were present in the physical space of the church, and again, I think that the vibrance of all of that encounter really mutually imbued both the work of the poets, and the work of the poets was imbuing this social activity as well. There was always all kinds of conversation happening between people who were literally contacting one another in the physical space of the church. Poets giving readings, dancers practicing in the sanctuary, activists organizing in whatever space or hall was available, parishioners who were, worshiping and also engaged in different kinds of activist and advocacy work as well. All of these people were finding and listening to one another and learning what one another were doing, and again, that shapes the cultural energy that radiates out from this little particular nexus.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to also bring up another resource that touches on this similar thesis, which is the book All Poets Welcome. That's what it's called. Can't remember the author, but I'll send that also out in the email. It's a really interesting resource. So Niles also is asking, the newspaper The East Village Other was the primary neighborhood publication in the 60s, publishing Julie Kupferberg in particular. Does it appear in the records that you referenced?
Yes, I mean, I think that was really that was sort of like the local publication of record for a number of the cultural figures who were deeply involved in the activity and life of the project. Of course, the other publication of importance being the Village Voice. Again, these were, I think there's a connection between the local spirit of those news and media publications and the proudly local spirit of what was happening at the project. I mean, at its core, the Poetry Project was and continues to be a space for people to gather in a physical space and listen to poetry and talk to one another before and after listening to poetry, and a place for people to gather and study. But it's all about there's a kind of neighborliness in that, right? And I think publications like the East Village Other and the Village Voice, similarly, these are publications where a critic is going to see a performance in their neighborhood, and then they're writing about the performance really specifically for a readership of other people within that community. And I think there's, again, something vitalizing that comes out of that celebration of community and place and the people who make community and place.
Thank you. So Susan Clark says, I think I saw Allen Ginsberg read Howl at the Poetry Project in the early 90s. Did that happen?
I would say almost certainly. Allen Ginsberg was very involved in the Poetry Project. he was never a director of the Poetry Project, but he was like always a kind of elder statesman from the early days up until his death. And I think that Ginsberg was also really deeply important to the particular, again, learning energy that surrounds the project. Ginsberg and Anne Waldman co-founded the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Naropa, which has been a very kind of sister presence in poetry with the Poetry Project. I think that Ginsberg's focus on other modes of consciousness, on globalism, or I shouldn't say globalism, but like a more internationalist perspective of of poetics and thinking and exchange. All of that has been very formative to the project, and he definitely read many, many times. He's probably one of the most represented poets in our archive.
Great. So Paula has a question. Hi, Paula. So she's wondering about the history of youth outreach with poetry, and wondering about the ways that has continued.
You know, I think well, we don't have anymore an explicitly youth focused area of our programming. We don't do stuff like poets in the schools. We don't have writing workshops that are only for youth. But I think what we do is we dedicate a lot of our outreach attention and energy to reaching young people who don't have access to university learning programming. So, you know, so much of literary culture today is shaped and perimetered by writing programs on university campuses. And I think that the Poetry Project is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, centers of poetry study outside of an academic setting in the U.S. And that you know, that continues to be something we take a lot of pride in, and something that we dedicate a lot of outreach energy to. And it hasn't diminished over decades. We've continued to be kind of home and magnet for young people hungry for poetry, who are looking for something outside of the academy.
Great. So I'm just looking at the time. It's 6:50, and I just am welcoming folks to ask any last questions in the Q&A. And I just wanted to thank you, Kyle, again for these really thoughtful answers and for such a wonderful presentation. And I think that might have been the last question for the evening, but I'm wondering if you have anything else you want to share, or just any last notes to share with our audience.
You know, just that it's a people formed place. I mean, the Poetry Project has been shaped by remarkable people who are drawn to this, you know, unwieldy, beautiful, inspiring idea of what a poetry community can be and should do, and that has you know, that's manifest so many surprising so many surprising programs, but also so many surprising friendships and collaborations, and poems, so many incredible poems over time. I feel incredibly grateful that there is a poetry project that many people have cared for and shaped this poetry project over time, and deep gratitude knowing that many people will continue to steward it for the future.
Definitely. Well, I'm definitely feeling very inspired by this talk, and yeah, our community is really grateful for the opportunity to partner with you and your community. So thanks to our audience, thanks to everyone who came tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Enjoy the full moon, and take care, everyone.
Thank you, Lena.
Thanks, Kyle.
Bye.
Bye-bye.